Hello everyone, this is lecture 5 of the course on behavioral economics. Today we are going to study methodology, types of empirical studies or primarily the types of methods that are used in behavioral economics. So, first of all we will be talking about what has been traditionally the approaches that are adopted by economists and psychologists and a comparison between them. So, economists and psychologists have traditionally used different empirical methods reflecting their distinct disciplinary focuses. Economists have relied more on field studies while psychologists have favored experimental studies. Recent trends show a shift in economics towards applied analysis and a broader range of empirical methods. There are two major types of empirical studies in behavioral economics. First, field studies. These are conducted in real world settings, observing behavior as it naturally occurs. Economists often use field studies to analyze market behavior, policy impacts and group dynamics. So, basically these methods are more commonly used by economists or preferred by economists. The other type of study is experimental studies. These are conducted in controlled environments, allowing manipulation of variables to test hypotheses. Most often psychologists use experiments to study individual motivation and decision making processes. Before discussing each of these in detail, it should also be mentioned that either type of study can be between subjects or within subjects. So, talking about between subjects experiments or studies, these actually compare different groups of subjects, each exposed to different conditions or tasks. For example, one group states preferences for rewards a week from now, another group states preferences for rewards a month from now. So, basically different groups of individuals are subjected to different kinds of treatments and the results are compared. On the other hand, when we talk about within subjects, then it examines the same subjects under different conditions or tasks. So, the same set of individuals go through different tasks or conditions. For example, subjects state preferences for rewards both 1 week and 1 month from now. The choice between these designs depends on the research question and practical considerations. So, it is primarily determined by the research agenda, how the objectives are framed and what kind of methodology suits best. It is observed that economists have tended to rely more on field studies, while psychologists have relied largely on experimental studies. The reasons are, first of all, focus on behavior. Economists study what people do. For example, we have a theory called the theory of revealed preference. So, revealed preferences in purchasing behavior, what they say primarily is that the choices or the preferences are revealed through purchases, right. So, economists are more concerned about what people do and not exactly why people do so. Psychologists on the other hand focus on why people behave as they do. So, they try to understand the motivation, the cognitive processes behind any particular activity or act. Second reason is that group behavior or markets. Economists prioritize studying group behavior, for example, markets, industries over individual behavior. Economists also study individual behavior, but then individual behavior in market settings can also be studied, and other than that when we go for further aggregating from individuals to firms and markets and then industry, then of course field studies are more appropriate, more suitable as compared to experimental studies. So, studying group behavior and markets are facilitated better by field studies. The third reason is that challenges with experiments. Economists historically viewed experiments as impractical or unethical in real world economic contexts. For example, governments may avoid experimenting with tax policies or educational subsidies due to potential risks. The idea is that experimenting too much with taxes or subsidies are considered as threats to the political entities. They do not want to tamper much with the existing systems because that may lead to losing votes, and as a result of which governments may avoid experimenting with tax policies or subsidies. Although observational studies do not allow the kind of manipulation of relevant variables that is possible in experimental studies, economists have often been able to overcome the resulting problems by using sophisticated statistical or econometric techniques that enable them to isolate the effects of specific variables. For example, there are econometric methods which try to basically filter out the impact of a particular variables. So, we use more advanced mathematical techniques. Several variables and their impacts are controlled for in order to identify or focus more on the impact of certain variables. So, field studies might have the disadvantage that it will have the impact of a large number of factors even when those factors are not intended to be considered by the original study, but then mathematical models or econometric methods help economists to filter out the impact of the factors that are of importance. Field studies involve observing real world decisions made by individuals in natural settings. For example, field study choices between expensive but energy efficient appliances and cheaper alternatives. So, for example, one can always observe that what kind of appliances people generally purchase given different kind of informations given to them by the shopkeepers or the sales representatives. So, there are like 5-star ratings, 3-star, 4-star, 2-star, single star on electrical appliances that talk about the energy efficiency of those appliances. The prices also vary, different features of those appliances also vary, but given the information on energy efficiency, one can always try to track that what kind of preferences individuals tend to have generally. Betting choices in horse races, investment decisions, for example, buying and selling stocks and bonds. So, these are examples of field studies. On these aspects, field studies can be considered in the sense that we can observe how people are actually behaving in natural environment. Consumers' responses to promotional offers in shopping contexts. We now consider an example of a field study conducted in 1998 in Israel. In this field study, basically the economists, they considered daycare systems. It was observed that parents were generally late in picking up their children from the daycare system, and that was causing a lot of inconvenience. So, what they did is that they selected certain daycare systems and then imposed some fines on the parents those who were coming late. So, on this diagram we have two lines. The blue lines are the ones which did not have fines imposed on the parents, or the daycare systems that did not go for imposition of fines, and the red line represent the daycare systems which went for fining the parents who were coming late. So, fine introduced at this point. Prior to that, there were movements ups or downs or parents coming late in both the daycare systems, and fine ended here. So, what is the observation between this period? It has been observed that we are measuring average number of parents arriving late on the vertical axis. So, it is observed that the average number of parents arriving late increased substantially. Previously, the average could have been somewhere here. Now, the average is somewhere here. So, the daycare system which imposed fines, they observed that parents were arriving much late as compared to when there was no fine on coming late. So, what is the observation? The observation is that lateness has a price and can be purchased like fruits, vegetables, etc. So, the parents were no more suffering from any moral obligations. They are not feeling guilty. They thought that fine, I can now go late because I will be paying a price for going late. So, I am basically purchasing the additional time that are given by the daycare workers, and that appears pretty much legitimate. So, market like incentives actually crowded out social preferences. When they were coming on their own on time, then that was because of social preferences. They were thinking that how they should behave in a social context. So, thinking about others, thinking about society is broadly understood as social preferences. So, arriving on time to pick up my child is my duty towards the society, and as a result of which they were arriving roughly on time, some days they were slightly late. But when prices are introduced, then it almost behaves like a market. So, now you can purchase their time. So, that is why it is said that market like incentives crowded out social preferences. And interestingly, what is observed is that even when fines ended, parents continued coming late. So, in for those daycares or in those daycare systems, parents continued coming late even when fines ended. So, now they are habituated to, some parents grew habituated to coming late, and they probably did not mind paying a fee for coming late. They probably wanted the system to continue with a payment system for coming late, and as a result of which they continue with this, whatever be the intentions. Now, the thing is that from these observations certain things are observed, or from this experiment or field study certain things are observed by the economists, but when the fines ended and the parents were still coming late, economists do not have any clear answer about why they were coming late. We can have certain conjectures or assumptions, like probably they want the fines to be retained. They want the daycare systems to pay fines or fine them, rather withdrawing the fines. So, that is what we assume, because that suits their convenience, they got habituated to it. But as such, we cannot understand that why actually, we do not have information to know exactly why they were still coming late. So, this is what is the difference between economic approach and a psychological approach, that economics just observe what is happening, as opposed to psychologists, they also try to understand why certain things are happening, why people are behaving in certain manner. There are certain advantages of field study. First of all, high ecological validity. These results reflect real world behavior. Results from field studies reflect real world behavior as they are based on actual decisions. So, field study actually does not go for any manipulation. So, that perfectly reflect how people should behave or how people generally behave. No concern about artificiality as the data comes from natural setting. However, there are certain challenges with field studies also. First of all, conceptual validity. Field studies may not always measure what they intend to measure due to confounds. So, what are confounds? Confounds occur when a result or reported value is a conflation of two or more effects which are not or cannot be isolated from each other. So, there are certain things we act in a particular manner when there are multiple factors work on us, multiple thought processes work on us. For example, if there is a class very early in the morning, then people may not be attending it, not because there could be several reasons. The first of all, the class might not be interesting one. Second thing is that the content of the class might be easily available from some other sources. The other factors could be like the students feel sleepy early in the morning. It is possible that they do not get food in their hostel mess before coming for the class, or there is too much of crowd, and so on. So, there could be a large number of factors that impact the behavior of a particular individual or a group of individuals. Now, confounds is that, so all of them acting together, how to separate out if you actually try to focus on one particular aspect. So, suppose as the teacher of the class I try to find out that is my content is very boring, or are my deliveries very boring, so that the students are not coming to the class. How to find out? Just by observing how many students are coming to the class is probably not sufficient. I need to find out what are the other factors that are impacting their decision to come to the class or not come to the class. So, these are confounds, and as a result of which conceptual validity could be lower in case of field studies, if we are not able to separate out the impact of several other factors impacting a particular decision. So, another example could be buying an inefficient but cheaper appliance may not indicate high discount rates for future cost savings. This implies that if I go for an efficient appliance, then I will be doing some cost saving in future. But if I am going for a cheaper and inefficient appliance, then I will not be able to save much cost in future. So, now when I am not interested in saving much cost in future, then this implies that we are discounting the future cost saving. but that might not be the case. There could be several factors that impact my decision. So, what are these factors? The factors may include ignorance of future cost savings. I might not be aware of how much cost saving better rated or a more efficient appliance can give me. Disbelief or uncertainty about future savings. Even if I am told that you are going to save this much of money through your electricity bills, reduced electricity bills, I may not actually believe it. Cash constraints preventing higher upfront costs. For example, I might not have much money right now to buy a more expensive appliance, and that is why I settle for a cheaper appliance. There could be other hidden costs related to more expensive appliances. For example, maintenance. I can go for high rated or more efficient appliance, but then a more expensive appliance will also have more expensive parts, as a result of which maintenance will be higher. The servicing could be more expensive. So, as a result of which overall I can foresee that much more expenses may come forth, and as a result of which I settle for something which is cheaper. So, a lot of factors are actually contributing to my decision to go for a cheaper and less efficient appliance, and it is not only the fact that I am not bothered about saving much cost in the future. The decision can be a random one or inability to grasp the future advantages as well, and as a result of which I go for a cheaper but less efficient appliance. Now, we have talked about the fact that economists prefer field studies and psychologists prefer experimental studies. We are yet to talk about experimental studies, but then there has been a rapprochement. The methodological divide between economists and psychologists led to significant separation between the two disciplines for much of the 20th century. Reconciliation began in the last 25 years, driven by psychologists studying economic decision making in economic psychology. So, psychologists also started taking interest in the field of economic decision making. On the other hand, economists also started adopting experimental methods influenced by Kahneman and Tversky, but a lot of contributions in the field of experimental economics have come from Vernon Smith, as a result of which experimental economics is now a recognized subdiscipline within economics. Now, talking about experimental studies in psychology and behavioral economics, experimental studies involve manipulating real or hypothetical scenarios to observe subject behavior. There are certain advantages. First of all, greater control over variables, allowing direct manipulation to determine their influence. So, I can design my experiment in such a manner so that the variables of concerns or focus are actually better controlled, and we direct our analysis or experiment in order to understand the impact of those variables better. For example, subjects bet more against a shabbily dressed diffident opponent than a confident professionally dressed one, even though outcomes are based on chance. So, if people are made to play a game which is completely a game of chance, still people have observed that it has been observed through experiments that subjects would be betting more against a shabbily dressed diffident opponent, and they would be more favorable to a confident, potentially professionally dressed one. Now, there are different types of rewards in experiments. First of all, real rewards. This motivates subjects to behave as they would in real life, increasing predictive accuracy. On the other hand, there could also be hypothetical rewards. Hypothetical rewards are like, I am told that I would be given 1000 rupees, how I am going to react to certain situations, or I am told that I am going to lose 1000 rupees and how I would again react to certain situations. So, these are hypothetical scenarios. Hypothetical scenarios are accused of not probably taking out or eliciting the best possible behavior, but the advantages are it offers flexibility, enabling studies with large rewards, losses or long time delays in intertemporal studies. Since I am not actually giving away the money, most often experiments with real rewards are actually very expensive. So, hypothetical rewards help us in conducting large experiments, because I can offer small rewards, I can offer large rewards, I can offer rewards to thousands of people, because everything is hypothetical. If some such studies are to be conducted using real rewards, the studies become so expensive that it is very difficult to conduct such studies. Kirby and Marakovic compared discounting under both kinds of situations using 30 permutations of 5 different rewards and 6 different delays, and concluded that the discount rates are lower for hypothetical rewards. So, what has been observed is that of course, real rewards and hypothetical rewards might at time come up with or yield different results, and as a result of which they have observed that with hypothetical rewards discount rates are actually somewhat lower as compared to when people did experiments with real rewards. Now, talking about design and interpretation of experiments, experiments can reveal insights into factors influencing behavior that are impractical to study observationally. However, economists often criticize behavioral experiments for flawed experimental design, interpretation of experimental results, and the treatment of assumptions. Now, I will be talking about these three in details. So, first of all, talking about experimental design issues, there are three main issues here. These relate to the use of financial incentives, the use of deception, and the lack of control. So, first of all, talking about use of financial incentives, economists argue financial incentives ensure real world like behavior and cognitive engagement. Previously, we have talked about the importance of incentives in neoclassical tradition. Economists place a lot of value to money or monetary incentive, and as a result of which economists are in favor of financial incentives to ensure real world like behavior. On the other hand, psychologists counter that incentives may distort the results by vitiating the intrinsic interest that subjects may have in participating in the experiment. So, if there are actually economic incentive or monetary incentive rather, then that would at times may overshadow the actual interest of the subjects. They would be more interested in participating the game, or the monetary incentive may influence their decision making, their participation in a particular experiment. So, now talking about evidence, there is actually mixed evidence on earned and unearned rewards. We actually cannot always say that monetary incentives are going to distort individuals' behavior, or on the other hand there are also evidences that monetary incentives may actually distort particular results or individuals' behavior towards the experiments. Now, we talk about the second point under experimental design issue, which is the use of deception. This is very common in psychology. 30 to 50% of studies in leading journals are found to use some form of deception in order to conduct experiments. The deception or use of deception is justified for creating situations that they would not otherwise be able to observe under normal circumstances. And then the second point is that masking the real purpose to prevent strategic behavior. For example, if individuals are told very directly about the purpose of the experiment, at times that may influence their behavior. So, it is at times desirable to hide the real intention behind conducting a particular experiment. That is why masking the real purpose comes into existence. And the first point is that experiments need to create situations that they would not otherwise be able to observe under normal circumstances. So, the experiments that could not be conducted under field study are actually conducted in laboratory experiments, right. But the problem is that subjects may become cynical. Knowing deception is common, requiring researchers to find naive participants, for example, freshman students. What it says is that when it becomes a common knowledge that psychologists conduct experiments which involves a lot of deception, then the knowledge of being deceived actually prevents more and more people from participating in experiments. As a result of which that becomes a discouraging factor, and psychologists may find it very difficult to identify or attract individuals to take participate or to take part in experiments, and as a result of which they need to depend to a large extent on freshman students, that is those who are coming to the campus for the first time, those who are new and those who are not actually, those who do not have information about how experiments are conducted. Experiments involve deception and things like that. The third point is lack of control. Economists criticize behavioral experiments for insufficient control leading to confounded results. For example, endowment effect. Some studies show strong endowment effect. Sellers demand twice what buyers offer, while others show none depending on experimental protocols. So, at times we generally understand that experimental studies tend to have better control, but then there are also situations where there could be possibility of a lack of control. In that case, the results would definitely be flawed. Now, coming to the second issue, the issue with interpretation of experimental results, a key challenge is ecological validity. Can lab findings be generalized to real world behavior? Most often not, because lab based experiments first of all deal with a very small number of individuals, and the behavior could be extremely subjective behavior or expression of their subjective understanding, which cannot be generalized to a large number of people. So, unlike physical sciences where laws are universal, human behavior is influenced by context, making extrapolation very difficult. Other than that, factors affecting behavior in the lab to differ from behavior in the field. The presence of moral and ethical considerations, the nature and extent of scrutiny of one's actions by others, the context in which the decision is embedded, and self selection of the individuals making the decision along with the stakes of the game. All these factors actually affect behavior in the lab and that differ from their behavior in the field. The moment one enters a lab for experiment, then of course, the person also understand that my activities are being scrutinized, they are being observed. So, their attitude becomes, they become more careful. On the other hand, those who are conducting the experiments, they are also under certain moral and ethical considerations. So, as a result of which the context in which decisions are being made might not be a completely natural environment or natural context, and accordingly there would be a large number of deviations. There could be a large number of deviations which otherwise you would not observe in the context of field studies. Self selection of the individuals making the decisions are also supposed to have some impact on their behavior, on their experiments. And finally, the stakes of the game. If the stakes of the game are large, then the decisions might be different at times compared to when the stakes of the game are small. So, when large rewards or large losses are there, then people may behave very differently as compared to when the amount of reward or the loss associated with the experiment is small. Then there is criticism for a tendency to be overzealous in making far reaching claims. Experimental economists are criticized for making broad claim based on limited data. So, generalization is not desirable in case of experimental studies. Nevertheless, it has been observed that experimental economists go for making broader claims which are based on pretty slender data. Another accusation is cherry picking of results to support theories while ignoring contradictory data. The results that suit your purpose, you report that. The one that does not suit your purpose, that does not explain what you intended to observe, you do not report that. So, talking about the third issue with the treatment of assumptions, Freudenberg observes that the normal approach in developing theories in behavioral economics has been to modify one or two assumptions in the neoclassical model in the direction of greater psychological realism. However, relaxing one assumption can have a knock-on effect on other assumptions, leading to inconsistencies in the overall set of assumptions, and that is why he suggests that the modelers need to take all the assumptions as a set and see how many need to be modified in order to end up with a new set of assumptions that is self-consistent. Now, we talk about purpose of study, field versus experimental studies. The choice between field and experimental studies depends on the study's purpose first of all. So, that includes a few factors. First of all, parameter estimation. Field studies are more appropriate for estimating real world parameters, for example, price elasticity of demand. Advantages: high ecological validity reflecting actual behavior in natural settings. The second point is theory testing. Experimental studies are better suited for testing competing theories. Advantage are control, replication and manipulation, which allow clear separation of predictions and identification of the best fitting theory. Beside field studies and laboratory experiments, there is something called extra laboratory experiments. It has been recently proposed that empirical studies should be reclassified to introduce a third category of study, which is extra laboratory experiments, which is basically a combination. It is a hybrid approach combining elements of field studies and experimental studies. These are conducted in the field while controlling for various factors to investigate the effect of a single variable. These are performed without subject's awareness, ensuring ecological validity. So, it has certain characteristics of field studies, but it is often used as a follow up to laboratory experiments. So, first laboratory experiments are conducted and then extra laboratory experiments are conducted in the field, so that whatever has been the drawback of laboratory experiments would be reflected in the extra laboratory experiments which are conducted in the field. So, that can also help us understand the validity of the laboratory experiments. So, the advantages are there would be higher ecological validity because subjects behave naturally as they are unaware of being observed. There would be control over variables because researchers can manipulate specific factors to study their impact, as some initial research would be also conducted in the laboratory experiments. We can also go for larger subject pools because it enables broader and more diverse participation than lab experiments. And finally, policy testing. These are useful for evaluating the effectiveness of policy interventions in real world contexts. So, with this I close the module on methods, the types of experiments that are conducted in behavioral economics. These are the two primary references. Thank you.